So welcome to the webinar today. We're pleased to have Erin Lothes as our speaker. And before we get started, introduce themselves in the chat box. And as you come in, you will be muted. Please just introduce yourself in the chat box. And when we get to the Q&A time, we'll turn the mute back off. Program today, we'll have a short introduction by the Diocese of Worcester team and the Boston Catholic Climate Movement from Fran and me. And then we'll have Erin provide her talk and then go into a Q&A session and close out with a call to action. I'd like to begin with a short prayer. Oh Lord, please, thank you for bringing these people together and for inspiring us with your creation. Help guide us in how we move to protect the creation you've given us, and for taking care of the people that are depending on that creation for their livelihood and for their life. Amen. I'd like to, again, begin with an introduction of the Environmental Stewardship Ministry in the Diocese of Worcester. We have created a ministry team under the bishop and under the chancellor in the Diocese of Worcester. Our goal is to increase awareness of Catholic social teaching on the environment, and to take that teaching and explain it in the context of the environmental impact to justice communities and the disproportionate impact on many people. And the result of this, we're hoping to inspire action within the Catholic community, not just within the operations in the church, but also within the families, and also to call people into action politically. Our programs are shown on the bottom of the slide. We've created a website to convey the information and to coordinate communication within the Diocese of Worcester on our environmental stewardship activities. We put together a large conference in 2018 and had about 160 people from over 50 different institutions, parishes, and schools get together. And it was very successful, and it allowed us to launch and make the environmental stewardship ministry very visible within the diocese. So now we have started two programs this year. One is the speaker series, which you're now part of, where we bring experts from across the country, and in fact with Lorna Gold from Ireland. So we bring people in to bring in the latest thinking in regard to Catholic teaching on this, and activism and what we can and should be doing. On the lower right is our program of how we outreach from the diocese into the parishes. Within every parish in the diocese, we're trying to create a liaison network of individuals who are known to the diocesan team, so that we can communicate our programs into the parishes and make sure that each of the parishes are aware of them and can take advantage of those programs. As you see, we're still in the process of building that out. We have about 21 parishes with liaisons, and hopefully growing to more very soon. Fran, would you like to talk about the Boston Climate Movement?
Sure. So full disclosure, Pete and Erin have done the majority of the work on this webinar, but we're very happy to co-sponsor. And the Boston Catholic Climate Movement is a chapter of the global Catholic Climate Movement. I'll leave you an email at the end if you're interested in finding out more about that. But our mission is to turn Pope Francis' Common Home encyclical into action for climate justice by undergoing spiritual conversion, transforming our lifestyles, and calling for bold public policies. And the photo in the middle is the people who attended our November 3rd Greening Your Parish conference. So we would invite all to become members, which basically means you get the newsletter. But anyhow, I'm looking forward to this webinar.
Excellent. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Erin Lothes. I'm very excited and honored to have Erin as our speaker today. Erin is a nationally and internationally recognized expert in the ethics of energy use, and is an author on a book on sustainability. I first learned about Erin's work when I heard her keynote speech from the Catholic Climate Covenant conference at Creighton this summer on Laudato Si in the U.S. Catholic Church. Erin has also spoken at the Vatican Ethics and Action Conference in Rome in 2018, where she presented on developing a moral consensus on sustainable development. Erin is an advocate for divestment of fossil fuel as a means to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and to a sustainable lifestyle. Erin's a professor, an associate professor of theology at St. Elizabeth College in New Jersey. Erin, welcome, and I'll turn the controls over to you at this time.
Hey, thank you so much, Pete, and thank you, Fran, and thanks everyone who is here. I am really delighted to be part of this conversation. I am going to talk about Catholic creation care and finding your role, and I think we have an excellent group of people on today, leaders for a long time, so you all are really part of the brain trust in Massachusetts, and I think we have an opportunity here to leverage the amazing work that you're doing by putting everyone in touch with each other and strategizing, because it seems like most of you have been working on this for quite a while and are greatly committed. So what I'm not going to do is talk about Laudato Si at great length, and I'm not going to talk about climate change at all. All of you know that climate change and global warming is a crisis and that the environment is under threat. So I'm simply taking that for granted. What I'm going to try to talk about is the barriers and the issues that make it hard for us to take a leadership role, both issues that confound that in ourselves and in our congregations and among the people we're trying to collaborate with. So there's a lot to consider right there. And I know that if you are probably very familiar with Laudato Si, and if you're not, it's easy to read and it's a wonderful read. You can easily purchase it on Amazon if you like a book, or go to the Vatican website and read it there. So all I'm going to say is that it's a historic document. It is the first encyclical to focus entirely on the nexus of environment and poverty, and to lift that up as a central part of Catholic social teaching, and to stress that it does look at the environment as a social problem. It's not simply an encyclical about global warming. It's about how the environment connects all of us. I would say its repeating theme is how everything is interconnected. And what we see is the core teaching of Jesus in the Great Commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves has been radically transformed here now, that we are called to love God and our neighbor as ourselves, and also to bring the earth into that relationship of responsibility in order to foster the common good. I would also say, if you're looking for a quick and easy summary of the main points of Laudato Si, look up the article Top 10 Takeaways by Father James Martin. That's an excellent short summary. But again, it's a very readable document if you want to grab your own copy. And I bet most of you have one. So it's actually more of interest to me to put Laudato Si in the context of Catholic social teaching, which began in 1891 when Pope Leo XIII wrote Rerum Novarum out of concern for the worker in city slums as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And he observed the transformation of agrarian poverty into urban poverty. This was a new thing. That's what Rerum Novarum means. And so that's the beginning concern of Catholic social teaching. How do we think about the needs of the poor in this new age? A second phase, or second wave of Catholic social teaching, looks at global development and is concerned that development take into account the needs of the whole person, not just economics, but the needs of the family, of children, of women, the needs for education, and always keeping human dignity at the core. Then we can see an expansion of these interests to an ecological concern. And this begins even before Pope Francis, with Pope Benedict's many writings. He has been referred to as the Green Pope. So there is excellent precedent for environmental attention in his works, in Caritas and Veritate, and many other speeches. Laudato Si is, as I said, historic in that it gives entire attention to the problem of the earth and all of its communities of life. And a wonderful aspect of that is its inclusive attention to multiple bishops' conferences around the world. Pope Francis cites many national bishops' conferences, which is unusual. Most encyclicals just cite other popes, so you can see his attention to local needs. And the core principles of Catholic social teaching are always human dignity, participation in the social process, solidarity, subsidiarity, taking care of issues at the lowest level possible and the highest level necessary. So prioritizing local authority and local concerns, but involving the state when needed. And care of creation is now a core theme of Catholic social teaching. The theological foundations go back to the core of our faith in Scripture and in the teachings of Jesus, recognizing that all are created in the image of God, all share that dignity, as stated in Genesis, and that dignity calls for equality, inclusion, and liberation from suffering. And since we know that environmental injustice impacts the poor first and worst, we are called to respond to it out of our same Christian obligation to care for the poor. And this is stated clearly in the Beatitudes and Matthew 25. Whatever you did to the least of these, you do it for me. And we see the poor suffering from climate change around the world. And that's the fundamental reason for our concern, as well as reverence for God's creation and seeing the sanctity and the sacramental beauty of creation. We can find these teachings in a tradition of sources. Again, it does not begin with Laudato Si in 2015. Official concern goes all the way back to a 1972 Vatican delegation to the UN Stockholm Conference on the Environment. There's an excellent document from St. John Paul II, his World Day of Peace message in 1990. I would also strongly recommend this document for a reading group. It's wonderful, it's short, it has all the main themes, and it's 30 years old, and it conveys these teachings. Again, Pope Benedict, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops have a document on climate change. The global bishops had very strongly worded appeals to the UN conferences at Lima and Paris, and there are libraries full of theological and ethical writings on the environment, on the spirituality of the environment, on scriptural sources, on attending to consumerism, on looking at the sacramental beauty of the earth. Every single topic has been written upon in great depth. I take a particular interest in energy because it's a massive source of the problem and it expresses the urgency of the problem. This graph shows how much gas and oil exists currently in presently known reserves and how that intersects with our attempt to keep warming below 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. If you look at the dark blue line, the lower dark blue line for 1.5 degrees, and trace it 25, that shows how the amount of carbon we can still emit and keep below a 1.5 degree temperature increase runs out in 2025 if we keep burning at the present rate. That's really soon. If we slow down our emissions, we can taper that line and keep burning till 2025. But we do not have a great deal of time left. We have to stop burning fossil fuels in order to shoot for a livable 1.5 degree increase. And this is something that the Vatican teaches is the responsibility of all of us. The Pontifical Academy of Justice and Peace has a book focused on energy, where they examine the connections between energy and justice and peace. And Laudato Si states that counteracting structural harm through our participation in the economy is neither optional nor secondary. This is not a hobby. It's not a secondary choice for some people who happen to be interested in the environment. Care for creation and attending to our participation in the economy is neither optional nor secondary. It's obligatory for all Christians to do this. That's Laudato Si, paragraph 217. And this takes place even when the impacts of our actions seem indirect. And that's one of the great challenges in encouraging responses to climate change, isn't it? Because our actions can be hard to connect to the atmosphere. It's hard to connect directly from my hamburger to, extra flooding in Bangladesh. These are very indirect yet interconnected issues. This photograph is a photograph of a solution to a fossil fuel economy. These are women who, these are solar sisters. They sell solar stoves and solar lights and empower each other to become entrepreneurs, bringing healthy solar-powered light and cooking options to places that currently use biomass, which is incredibly dirty and unhealthy. So this is really a fabulous solution that is transforming the fossil fuel economy. What is the moral mandate for ourselves in advanced nations? Well, Laudato Si states that there is an urgent need to develop policies to limit emissions and substitute for fossil fuels. There's an urgent need to substitute for fossil fuels. How urgent? Well, our carbon budget is going to run out by 2025. That's very urgent. And it's a matter of justice. The developed countries ought to help pay their ecological debt by limiting their consumption of non-renewable energies. By ecological debt, the Pope means that advanced countries have already used an enormous part of the carbon budget. We have emitted the greatest proportion of emissions historically, and that leaves us in debt to developing nations who are also entitled to move up the ladder of sustainable development. So how do we do that? Well, this text from the Vatican says we have the moral duty of developing new energy technologies, the more complex, the new renewable technologies, in order to allow poor countries to first develop with the simplest, most readily available technologies, which may be the fossil fuel ones. So I focus on energy, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. Transportation matters enormously. Diet is hugely significant. I think we're all coming to realize buildings matter. Heavy industry, cement, these things all have to be transformed. So in the church, clearly, we have an enormous body of teachings. We have authoritative documents from the very highest level, and these are critical. Yet, even with all these teachings and official documents, Often less is done than we would like, and that may be the understatement of the century. And that's the driving question for my book. Why is it that so little seems to be done when we're facing such a crisis, and when we as a church are morally oriented to care for the poor? How do we overcome the gap between theoretical recognition of our obligation and actual action? Okay, well, what are those gaps? What I've done is interview and conduct focus groups with faith-based environmentalists around the country, and pooling all of their wisdom. They helped point to 3 gaps. One, a knowledge gap, when someone's not convinced or concerned that global warming is real or is a problem. Nowadays, that's diminishing. People are increasingly aware and concerned. A caring gap is the situation of someone who knows there's a problem, but they're conflicted. It's hard to commit. There's other things they care about. And then the action gap is, I care, but what do I do? How can I get involved? Okay, how do we think about this? What does climate change psychology tell us? First of all, the knowledge gap is built of ordinary scientific literacy limitations, and we know those are very real in this country. This is a country that has challenges understanding that evolution is real. And we have to grant that climate change is complicated. It's very hard to understand. So it's legitimate to find it challenging. Secondly, there are cognitive limitations in the way our brains are structured, and I'll say more about that. Thirdly, I think there's personal inclination. Some people have a politics that takes them one way or another. Some people's hobbies incline them to attend to the natural world. They may be bird watchers, or they may be kayakers. Those people may be more likely to pay attention to the natural world than someone who likes to assemble model airplanes, and that's just a personal inclination. Then there's willful ignorance, and this is one of the ethical boundaries, when people prefer not to recognize the problem out of willful ignorance. And I think increasingly the pain of the problem is a big part of that. To speak about cognitive limitations, there's just ways that our brains are structured. We're susceptible to framing, the way a question is put. People will support policies differently in surveys if it's described as a carbon tax or a carbon offset. So it's very important to use neutral language, or carefully tested language that's been evaluated by psychologists. Our preconceptions can filter the information that we use. It's very important to use core values to bridge divides. And the human animal has a resistance to long-term thinking. We're used to running away from the tiger that's right in front of us, not thinking 30 years down the line. Helpfully, religious people can take a long view, looking ahead to the obligation to bring about the reign of God over the years. Another problem is the reality of being overwhelmed. And our brains can kind of shut down when there's too much. People speak of a finite pool of worry, only so much that anyone can take in as their worry. And when they get to the end, that's just it. It's important also in different groups to acknowledge that there is some ambiguity in some dimensions of the science, and to speak about solutions to help people who may be feeling overwhelmed. The caring gap speaks about knowing that there's a problem, but being conflicted. My research participants spoke about the problem of consumerism as a relentless onslaught, that they were seduced by the power of consumerism to just keep on buying more, to keep in step with progress, and that their lives were filled with distraction. And the simple fact that for some people, they're not interested. How do we move past the problem of the caring gap? Well, it's important to highlight the core values that people have and connect that to climate change. So if submerged values about caring for the neighbor and being frugal and avoiding waste and garbage and avoiding lifestyle habits that increase emissions is a fundamental value, yet it gets drowned out by the need for convenience and the need to follow the Joneses, we have to reconnect those values. And being in discussion is one way to do that. It brings up the core values and reconnects them with ecological concerns. This is a way that our faith identity can be linked to ecological concerns, and a new synthesis comes out. People feel safe in a parish to raise questions, to maybe admit what they don't know, or to admit their struggles with trying to change their lifestyles. It's a safe space, and so those discussions are very helpful. And familiar people offer moral support. This is extremely important. People can feel very guilty and uncomfortable talking about it. The action gap is a situation of caring, but not being sure what to do, or being paralyzed in moving forward. We're all busy. Many times it's just more comfortable to do the non-sustainable thing. We have our habits, and some of my participants have said, are we really just lazy? Are we really just addicted? How do we overcome that? And finally, again, being overwhelmed. It's a huge problem. It can seem that nothing could make any difference in our own actions, so why even try? So how do we find hope and not betray the Gretas in our own lives? How do we stand by the young people and move on past the action gap? Well, many studies point to the power of social groups, that group action accelerates social change, that lifting up shared values reinforces individual motives, reminds people of how important these things are to them because they're part of the group, that focusing on group identity promotes a willingness to choose delayed benefits. People can say, yes, I can wait for something. I can make sacrificial decisions. This is who I am. I'm part of this group. And certainly let networks leverage one's own individual activity. Also, it's more fun. And religious congregational groups, I think, have particular gifts even beyond the power of any group, of the Sierra Club. And that is the moral orientation of faith communities. People in a church are willing to examine their own behaviors. We have multiple rituals that do that. Some of you may have seen the Eco-Examine that the Jesuits have put out. It's excellent, and it just means that that's part of our culture, to examine our behaviors and try to change them. In a community that is explicit about ethical expectations, norms can diffuse through the group. New ideas, new expectations filter through, and people can take on new expectations. We find the encouragement of friends within, again, this safe space. Then there's the virtue of persistence, which is so important, and the inspiration of Christian hope, which we also have to rely on. So I want to talk some more about the power of social identity. It has a lot of potential. Group goals matter to people, and with the teachings that we have the potential to draw on person's identity as Catholics and their responsiveness to the Pope. For example, 35% of Catholics say the Pope's message influenced their own views on global warming, twice as many as Americans in general. And 77% of Catholics strongly or moderately trust the Pope for global warming information. That's a very high number. So this shows how there's influence in attending to what the church does. A group at the Yale Center on Climate Change Communication conducted 2 studies and found that while it may seem redundant, Christian beliefs motivate Christians. 19% said that protecting God's creation is their highest motivator, right behind caring for their grandchildren. A second study showed that hearing the message that it is our responsibility to be good stewards actually increased survey participants' beliefs in a series of environmental statements. Some participants were asked to do a word sorting exercise, and some participants were asked to read a number of messages, including this one, and by being primed with the message, it increased their tendency to say that protecting the environment is a moral issue. So being reminded that care for creation is part of Christian identity increases people's tendency to believe that it's important to act on that. Now, this is what we should do, and we need to lift it up more because people are not always getting that message. People are not always hearing homilies. It's a best kept secret. This is the title of a popular textbook on Catholic social teaching, because Catholic social teaching itself is a best kept secret. And I think the fact that Catholics are called to care for creation is not necessarily the first thing everybody thinks about when they think about Catholics and faith-based groups. Global warming itself is a best kept concern. 6 in 10 Americans rarely or never discuss global warming with family and friends. This is a huge problem. Nothing can become a social norm if we don't discuss it. So it's very important to talk about climate change. It makes me think about the rabbits in Watership Down who moved into the field with the silver snares, and they never discussed it. They were coexisting with this threat that they couldn't discuss. And we have to lift it out in the open. We have to fight the silence, talk about this, and support each other so that we can move on to making it something we can address. Create spaces for discussion. There are excellent books. I recommend the Renew book on Laudato Si, which is a great tool for small groups in the parish. And to pray that we all increase our sense of responsibility. This prayer here comes from Pope Francis's message for the World Day of Prayer this past September. And he writes, "May God grant us the courage to do good without waiting for someone else to begin or until it is too late." This could be an excellent intercessory prayer on a weekly basis, reminding us that we are called to assume our responsibility for the care of creation. This phrase, "before it is too late," brings up the emergency question. Activists wonder if it's best to preach positive solutions or warn of emergencies and stimulate people to action because they're reminded of how dire the situation is. There really isn't research that I've found that settles that question. I think most research talks about the need to speak of positive solutions because of how overwhelmed and emotionally drained people are with this overwhelming topic. One recommendation I see is to use 3 positive statements for every 1 dire warning. But we know that the doomsday apocalyptic message is not working. We can't lead with that. I think that it's good to recognize that different messages work for different groups and to try to know your audience. There's a spectrum of allies. Some people are ready to move on to strong action just with some leadership and some encouragement and making it easy in some way. And some people need to start a little bit more at the beginning and get to know more about Laudato Si and know more about climate change before they may move on to join you. And here I will say, I didn't make a slide for it, but it's so important. the role of a persistent leader to keep going alone if necessary, or if trying to form a group, reach out individually and invite people. The personal invitation makes a huge difference. We also need, when communicating positively, to be sure our messages reach all within the church. There's no secret that our society is highly polarized, and it's dragging our country down. And some of that polarization reaches into the church as well. And that affects our ecological mission. These two cartoons and titles refer to blogs on the CatholicEcology.net blog written by Bill Patenaude. And he has asked a really good question. Can half of the church carry the whole ecological mission? Meaning, to be direct, can the liberal half of the church do all the work on the ecological mission? And the answer is no. We need the entire church, and we need to recognize that this is not a partisan issue. This is not a political issue. This is a humanitarian issue, and it's a question of faith in honoring God's creation that was given to us to care for all and share God's abundance with every single person. Also, in communicating, it's necessary to talk about morality without moralizing. That turns people off. We have to recognize that it's legitimate for people to have different economic philosophies, different levels of scientific literacy, yet we can all still try to collaborate on core projects and emphasize solutions. I see this as the Jesus versus John the Baptist approach, looking at how we can foster abundance and look at the solutions that do exist rather than focus on the doomsday. So this allows us to think big and strategize about what can be done. Here are some things that are important for consumers to do. Purchase renewable energy and think about their lifestyle changes. As citizens, advocate for important policies, listen to each other, and explore impact investing. As Pete said, I do support divestment and impact investing, and there's an excellent collaborative that is a group of professionals to support that. I'll skip over this. You can look at it later, but it shows that we need $1 trillion annually to go into clean energy research. There's massive amounts of money are needed, and it just points to the scale of the problem. How then, with the problem at this scale, can each of us contribute? And to me, this invites us to think about a spirituality of creative sacrifice. And here's St. Francis again, giving his cloak to the leper. Each of us is only one person. We can't do everything. We have to acknowledge and accept our finitude because we have no choice. But we are the church together, and there are things we can do. We can eliminate some of the least important activities in our lives and make a little space for the priority of ecological leadership. And that's what all of you are doing. So ideas, many things can be done, as you see here. Conduct a parish energy audit. Involve the children by having a blessing of the animals or the stuffed animals like they have in my school. Everyone brings in their stuffed animals. Connect with Solar Sisters and do a Advent donation of solar stoves, sort of like the rice bowl, but a little different. Plan a carbon fast for Lent, etc. And finally, act with gratitude and joy. When you read Laudato Si, that loving, grateful attitude comes through it. To be comforted knowing that Christ is present to every being and that God has given us creation as an act of love, and we ourselves are God's gift to ourselves, and to treasure our own life and our capacity to be part of this mission. He says, one of the last lines is, let us sing as we go. And I think that's so encouraging to remember. So I will end with some reflection questions. When you think about the ecological conversion that Laudato Si inspires, what changes would you feel are necessary in your own life to live out this ecological conversion? What is possible? And what seems impossible, but what might you hope to achieve down the road? Secondly, which of your personal and faith values most connect with your commitment to these ecological actions? And then thirdly, maybe reflect on how you've encountered or processed conflicting feelings. How have you balanced this earth ministry and your other necessary and essential responsibilities? These are some of the references I drew upon, and thank you.
Well, Erin, thank you very much. Appreciate your inspiring words and discussion. It's time for Q&A, and everyone can unmute themselves if you have a question you'd like to pose. Does anybody have anything to start us off? I'll make one comment in regard to what you said. One point you commented about was the fact that you have to accommodate people that are starting from many different starting points, and so one message doesn't fit all. So we need to be good listeners and understanding who we're talking to and where they are in understanding the challenges and making a decision. The other thing I would say is that positive statements are needed. I think it is, with the political environment we're in this country at this time, it's easy to get very depressed and be concerned that there's nothing can be done. And one of the things that in Massachusetts, we have the good fortune of a progressive legislative and government structure that's very aware of the urgency of taking action. And so in our work locally here in the Diocese of Worcester and in my local town where I do some other work, I'm always emphasizing how much opportunity there is for people in Massachusetts, because the government has some great programs to assist in this transition. In fact, to motivate and require changes in this transition. So I think there's a great opportunity for Massachusetts people to lead and to act.
That's absolutely true. And if we look beyond action at the federal level, there is a lot going on at every other level, by governors, by mayors. There's so much happening in my state of New York. So it is important to look at different levels of action, even in the private sector. There's good leadership happening in many corporations and certainly a lot of non-governmental organizations. If you look at Inside Climate, there's a clean energy wire of news and updates, which I find is full of encouraging news about how clean energy is growing all the time. So it's good to be aware of that.
So Fran has posed a question: what is the best way to communicate the urgency of climate action to parishioners given limits on interest and time of priests? So kind of, I think it's a question of within the structure of a parish where priests are consumed by many other, from funerals to weddings and fundraising and all the issues they have. How do we, as lay people, break through that?
I think that if you have a program or initiative that is being planned, to share that, that's more active than simply praying in the intercessory prayers, although I think that's really important. And if the pastor can include intercessory prayers for creation every week, that would be wonderful. But if there's an initiative going on to maybe request a little time after the homily for a layperson to stand up and share it and invite people to participate, then people have a concrete action that they can join. Another thing is to involve the CCD program, if at all possible. In my parish, the confirmation classes design the carbon fast every year. And people listen to young people. They have the ultimate credibility on this question. And that can be a really good way to start something. So maybe a short line from Laudato Si that talks about the impact on the poor. Probably not leading with a lot of doom and gloom about the weather or, sea level rise, but how we are concerned about the vulnerable around the world leads us to this initiative that we have planned, and please join us in these concrete ways.
A question from Mary Small concerning recycling goods, in particular, difficult to recycle goods. So I think and this was in the context of, does the diocese have any suggestions or resources? So we do have information on recycling on the website. And Mary, if you want to follow up with me concerning kind of exactly what materials you're considering difficult to recycle, I could respond more explicitly. As you all may be aware, the recycling industry is in somewhat of a challenged position right now because we are consuming so much, and we have put so much into the recycling stream that the consumption, the demand for recycled material is not keeping up. It's important to look at ways to reduce our use of materials and reuse as much as possible. And recycling is a best alternative if a material is no longer usable. But we really need to reduce and reuse as much as possible. And yes, plastic bags, she mentions in the chat session, can be recycled, and there are certain retail outlets that take plastic bags. In Westboro, there are groups like the Girl Scouts who collect textiles for recycling. And I think there's more and more groups that are handling textile recycle. So again, if we could follow up offline concerning the specifics on that. Any other questions from people who, anybody would like to unmute and ask a question? I had one other thing, and I guess it comes up in my call to action, so maybe I'll use this to transition to my call to action. I think there is a social dynamic that you alluded to, Erin, in regard to getting involved with a group is an easier way to create social change than trying to do it by yourself. You have other people who reinforce with you how important it is, give you new ideas, give you encouragement. So I think getting involved in a group activity is important. And part of what my parish liaison, the Diocese of Worcester Parish Liaison Program, is to create a network of parishes that can talk to each other and share how you are working within your parish, whether it's recycling, energy efficiency, prayer, study groups, education programs. All of those activities can be shared among parishes. And so by creating this network of parish liaisons, I believe that we can create kind of a learning organization where we teach each other and we learn from each other, and also rejuvenate our spirit as we're venturing off to do this activity that can at times be frustrating. Erin, did you have anything further on the social dynamic?
Well, I just am very excited about the mission that both the Boston Catholic Climate Movement and the Diocese of Worcester Environmental Stewardship Programs have. They're ambitious missions, and I think that with a group that thinks about what's right for them and what their members are excited about, and that could certainly vary, as you said, from spirituality to education to energy efficiency, to come together and come up with an ambitious mission, I think is itself energizing, because we know we have a big problem. We know that small, trivial actions are not going to solve the problem and are not going to satisfy us. And so to act boldly, I think, is energizing, and to have the company of our fellow parishioners is wonderful. So I hope that the leadership of everyone here finds great support in answering, and it may take time for those who have new groups, but that is very encouraging. And I think it's terrific, something we were mentioning beforehand, that there is a multi-diocesan network talking about how they're advancing creation care in, at least 18 dioceses. That's terrific. And I think we're at a time where the tide is turning for social awareness, and people are ready to start talking about climate change and acting. And I'm seeing it in the consumer options. I'm seeing it in the number of Tesla, charging centers. I'm seeing it in a lot of places. So I think that the time is right.
So Erin, could you turn off your screen sharing, and I'll just flip through a couple of final slides and
Sure.
Let me share. Mine, and again, I'm very anxious to build out this parish liaison network. If you are a parishioner at a church and you don't see a little green cross on your parish, please send me an email and volunteer to be the parish liaison for your parish. We have a series of roundtable meetings in different regions within the diocese for parishes to get together face to face and share their experiences and best practices. You can sign up for all of this on the Diocese of Worcester website. I will send out these slides so you'll have the links and emails. Also wanted you to make you aware of an organization called the Faith Science Alliance. The Faith Science Alliance was formed at the initiative of Cardinal Sean O'Malley and Philip Duffy from Woods Hole Research Center. Got together a group of interfaith leaders and scientists to work together to add the moral and scientific voice in advocacy within the state of Massachusetts. A key player on this is Jim Driscoll, who's the executive director of the Massachusetts Catholic Conference. Massachusetts Catholic Conference is the political advocacy arm for the Catholic Church in Massachusetts. We worked with Jim and developed a pastoral letter from all 4 bishops in the state of Massachusetts that you can find on the Diocese of Worcester website. Comes out with a strong statement in regard to the urgency of action for Catholics on climate change. There will be a convocation of the Faith Science Alliance at the Pastoral Center at the Archdiocese of Boston Pastoral Center in Braintree in January. You can go to the faithsciencealliance.org website. The registration page is not open yet, but it will be open soon. I encourage you to attend. This is an opportunity to meet with state legislators and others who talk about the current climate legislation and the things that the state is doing or considering doing to move more aggressively on climate change. And it's a great opportunity to meet with other people of faith from multiple faith organizations and meet with these political leaders. I'd encourage you to try to participate in that. Fran, did you have any final comments you wanted to add before we wrap up?
Nice.
You
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to encourage everyone who has expressed interest in, keeping at it. And we have lots of things to look forward to this spring, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. We have the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si in May. And, there's great opportunities during Lent. Right now during Advent, there's lots of opportunities to look at consumerism. I'll send Pete a pretty extensive bibliography of Advent reflections and suggestions. Very possible to clip some of these things, put them in, submit them to your parish bulletin. It's a way to sort of get people thinking about these things. So there's lots of opportunities. Again, would invite anyone who hasn't already signed up to participate in the Boston Catholic Climate Movement. And I sent the email address up front, and I think Pete will send that again. So thank you so much for this this webinar today. I'll look forward to looking back over at those very rich slides that you presented, Erin.
Thank you very much, Erin, for taking the time out of your busy schedule and sharing your thoughts. It's been very valuable.
I'm just delighted to speak with you all. I'm from Massachusetts originally myself, and I feel there's just so much great energy. So it's good to connect, and I hope to cross paths with many of you at future gatherings. So thank you for inviting me, and good luck to everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.